Caleb Mercer found her the way a man finds something that changes his life without warning, without mercy, without time to decide if he was ready. She was face down in the frozen mud beside his barn, wrapped in blood-stained cloth. Her whole body shaking so hard the frost around her was trembling too. He almost stepped over her. Almost. But something in the sound she made, not a scream, not a cry, just a broken breath caught between living and giving up, stopped him cold. He knelt. He turned her over, and the woman opened her eyes and said the last thing he expected. "Please," she whispered. "Don't call anyone." If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel, follow along to the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The cold came in hard that February. The kind of cold that didn't just bite it, settled into the bones of the earth and stayed there. Caleb Mercer had been awake since before the sun touched the ridge. That was the way of it when a man lived alone. No reason to sleep late, no one to sleep beside. He pulled on his coat, stomped into his boots, and stepped out into the dark with a lantern and nothing on his mind but the horses. He smelled it before he saw it. Blood had a particular smell in the cold, not sharp the way it was in summer. Something heavier, something that sat low to the ground and didn't rise. He stopped walking and held the lantern out, turning slow. And that was when the yellow light caught the trail in the mud. Dark, half-frozen, dragged, rather than dripped. Caleb followed it around the corner of the barn. She was curled against the woodpile, knees drawn up, head down, wrapped so tight in gray cloth that he almost mistook her for a bundle of rags someone had thrown out. But Rags didn't shake. Rags didn't breathe in short, desperate pulls the way this bundle was breathing. And Rags didn't have dark hair spread over frozen mud like something precious that had been dropped and not picked back up. He crouched, set the lantern down, reached out and touched her shoulder. She flinched so hard she nearly rolled off the woodpile. "Easy," he said. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." She turned her head, and the lantern caught her face, pale as birch bark, eyes too wide a cut at her temple, dried black with cold. She looked at him the way a rabbit looks at the thing that has found it in the brush. Still, waiting, deciding if running was even possible. "You're on my property," Caleb said, keeping his voice low. "My name's Caleb Mercer. This is Briar Hollow. How'd you get here?" Her lips moved, but nothing came out. "Can you stand?" She shook her head. "All right." He pushed up to his feet and reached for her. "I'm going to carry you inside. Get you warm." "Don't." The word came out cracked and sharp at the same time. Her eyes sharpened too, the fear sharpening into something more urgent than fear. "Don't touch, don't unwrap me, don't take the cloth off, please." Caleb went still. She was watching him with something close to desperation, and underneath the desperation was something older and harder, the look of a woman who had made that specific request before and been ignored. "I won't," he said, quietly, meaning it. "I won't touch the wrapping, but I need to get you off this ground before you freeze. Will you let me carry you in?" A long pause. The wind moved through the yard. "Yes," she whispered. He picked her up carefully, keeping his arms beneath her the way she asked, not pulling at the cloth, not adjusting it. She weighed less than she should have. She was warm in a wrong way. The sharp, feverish warmth that meant the body was burning itself trying to stay alive. He carried her across the yard and through the cabin door and set her down on the cot near the stove. He built the fire up fast. Didn't look at her. Didn't press her. Filled a tin cup with water and held it out. She didn't take it. He looked up. That was when he understood. She was watching him with those wide, exhausted eyes, and her arms, he'd noticed without noticing the way a man notices something his mind hasn't caught up to, yet her arms weren't shifting to take the cup. The cloth was wrapped from her shoulders down. She hadn't moved her hands once. She hadn't reached for the doorframe when he carried her. She hadn't braced against his chest. Very slowly, Caleb set the cup on the floor beside the cot. "I'm going to loosen the cloth at your shoulder," he said. "Just enough so you can get comfortable. I won't—" "You'll see," she said. Flat. Certain. The voice of someone who had given up arguing against the inevitable. See what? She closed her eyes. Please, she said again. Just let me lie here. I'll leave before sunrise. You won't have to. You're bleeding through that wrapping, Caleb said. You're not leaving before sunrise. You're not leaving until you can walk without falling. He pulled his chair up to the cot and sat. But I won't touch that cloth again until you tell me it's all right. Understood. She opened her eyes. She looked at him for a long time, searching his face the way people search for a lie they already expect to find. She didn't find one. My name is Abigail, she said. Abigail Vale. All right, Miss Abigail Vale. He picked up the cup and held it out again. Drink something. This time, when she didn't reach for it, he simply held it steady close enough that she could drink from the rim without moving. No comment, no hesitation, just patient. She drank. Then she leaned back against the cot and closed her eyes, and Caleb sat with her while the stove popped and the dark outside the window slowly began to gray toward morning. He was frying salt pork when she woke up and spoke again. I was born this way. He turned from the stove. She was looking at the ceiling. Her voice was even practiced, even the kind of evenness that comes from having said something difficult so many times that the difficulty has been smoothed away on the surface, even if it goes all the way down underneath. Without arms, she said. I was born without arms. Caleb turned back to the pan, moved the pork. Let the silence sit for a moment before he answered. That explains why you didn't want me unwrapping you, he said. People react. She said it simply. They always react. I reckon they do. He slid the pork onto a plate. How do you feel about eggs? Another silence. Longer this time. I what? Eggs. He held up the pan. I've got 4. I usually only make 2, but you look like a woman who hasn't eaten since before whatever happened to your ribs happened. She made a sound. It took him a moment to realize it was almost a laugh. Yes? She said. Eggs would be yes. Thank you. He cooked the eggs and set the plate on the floor by the cot, the same way he'd offered the water, close enough to reach without her having to ask for help. He watched from the corner of his eye the way she managed it. She shifted on the cot, tucked the cloth to free her movement, and ate with her feet. Her toes curled around the fork handle with a steadiness that spoke of years of practice of discipline, of a life lived finding ways through things other people assumed were impossible. He didn't stare. He didn't comment. He just ate his own breakfast and let her eat hers. You're not going to ask, she said finally. About what? About any of it. Why I'm here. Who hurt me. Why I was in your yard. She paused. Most people ask. Most people aren't minding their own business, Caleb said. You'll tell me what I need to know when you decide I need to know it. She set the fork down. You live alone, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. You're not afraid of me. He looked up. Should I be? She looked back at him with those 2 direct eyes. The people who sent me running think so. People think a lot of things, Caleb said. Doesn't make them right. No. She slept most of that first day. Caleb checked the wound on her ribs mid-morning. She had finally allowed it with her eyes closed and her jaw tight, and that same braced stillness she probably wore every time a stranger came near her body with any kind of intention. The cut was deep but clean. Someone had pressed cloth against it and wrapped her tight, but the wrapping had soaked through. He worked quickly and quietly, replacing it with clean linen, and when he was done, he moved back to his chair without making her feel like she owed him anything for it. Thank you, she said, eyes still closed. Yes, ma'am. She made that almost laugh sound again. He was outside checking the fence line when he heard the horses. 3 riders coming down the road, fast kicking up frozen mud, moving with the kind of purpose that wasn't a social call. Caleb set down the fence post and walked to the middle of the yard with his arms loose at his sides. The man at the front pulled up hard and looked down at him from a big gray horse. He was broad, well-dressed for the territory, with a badge that caught the thin winter light and a face that had learned a long time ago how to look trustworthy. "Morning," the man said. "Thomas Rusk, Sheriff of Carver County. You, Mercer?" "I am. Seen anyone come through your property last night or this morning? Woman, dark hair wrapped in gray cloth. She's wanted." Rusk reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Murder. 3 counts. Men found dead in the freight office over in Garnet 3 days ago." Caleb looked at the paper. A sketch rough but recognizable. The name printed beneath it in heavy black letters: Abigail Vale, dangerous. Reward offered. 3 men, Caleb said. "Good men," Rusk said. "Business owners. Respectable." He leaned forward in the saddle. "The woman is cunning. Don't let the her condition fool you. She's dangerous in ways you wouldn't expect." "Her condition," Caleb repeated. Rusk's expression didn't shift. "She's deformed. Born without arms. Don't let that make you soft-hearted. She's still capable of poisoning a man's drink." Caleb looked at the road behind the riders, then at the tree line, then back up at Rusk. "Haven't seen anyone," he said. "Been out since before dawn. Yard's been quiet." Rusk watched him, long, measuring. "She's bleeding," Rusk said. "One of the men fought back before he went down. If you see blood trails—" "I'll keep my eyes open," Caleb said. "There's a $20 reward." "Appreciate the information, Sheriff." Another pause. Rusk pulled his horse's head around. "You find her." The sheriff said, "You come to me first, not the county judge. Me." He rode out with his men behind him, and Caleb stood in the yard until they were gone from sight. Then he walked back into the cabin, closed the door, and leaned against it. Abigail was sitting up on the cot. She had heard. "You lied to him," she said. "I told him I hadn't seen anyone come through," Caleb said. "That's technically true. You were already here when I found you." "Caleb!" It was the first time she'd used his name. She said it like a warning. "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me. That's $20. That's real money. You could—" "I could," he agreed. "I didn't." "Why?" He pulled his coat off and hung it by the door, moved to the stove and checked the fire. "He told me not to go to the county judge," he said. "A sheriff who wins tells you to go to the judge. A sheriff who's hiding something tells you to come to him first." Abigail was quiet. "Also," Caleb said, 3 men were found dead in a freight office. You're wrapped in blood-stained cloth. You've got a wound in your ribs, and you ran far enough and hard enough to end up in my yard half frozen. If 3 respectable men decided to corner a woman with no arms in a freight office, I've got a feeling about who started what." The fire popped. "You'd be wrong," Abigail said. "Tell me where I'm wrong." She looked at him. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes were bright with something that wasn't fear anymore. It was closer to the look of someone deciding against every reasonable instinct to trust. "I drugged their whiskey," she said. "I only meant for them to sleep. I needed to get out and they'd locked the door and—" She stopped. "I didn't know it would kill them." "What kind of drug?" "Laudanum, more than I understood. Her voice didn't break, but it thickened. "I didn't mean for anyone to die. What were they doing in that office?" She didn't answer. "Miss Vale." "What they'd been doing for a long time," she said flatly. "To women they thought couldn't fight back. To women they thought no one would believe." The stove ticked in the silence. Caleb sat down in his chair. "And the sheriff," he said. Rusk knew. Her voice went flat and hard at the same time. "He'd been paid to know and not act. I had proof. I'd been gathering it for months, names, dates, payments. I went to him first." She exhaled. "He told me if I showed those papers to anyone, he'd have me committed to the state asylum before the week was out. He said a woman without arms, who thought she could accuse decent men of anything, would be considered unwell by any reasonable doctor." Caleb said nothing. "He would have done it," she said. "He still might." "Where's the proof now?" She held his gaze. Steady, deliberate. "Inside the cloth," she said. "The wrapping. Folded against my left side where the wound isn't." Caleb looked at the wrapped cloth. At the woman inside it. At the weight of what she'd just told him. "So you've been carrying evidence against the sheriff of this county," he said, "wrapped against your body, bleeding across 3 days of winter with a posse on your trail." "Yes." "And the evidence, if it gets to the county judge, Rusk loses his badge. The men who paid him lose their businesses and probably their freedom." She paused. "The girls they hurt get believed." Caleb stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the empty yard where the sheriff's horse tracks were still pressed into the mud. He stood there a long time. "All right," he said. "All right what?" He turned around. "All right, you stay. All right, you're not going anywhere until you can walk without bleeding. And all right." He looked at her steadily. "We figure out how to get those papers to someone Rusk can't buy." Abigail Vale looked at him across the small, firelit room. "You understand what you're saying," she said. It was not a question. It was a last chance to take it back. "I understand perfectly." "He will come back." "Yes," Caleb said. "He will. And when he does, he won't come with 2 men. He'll come with more." "I expect so. You'd be risking your ranch, your land, everything you've built here." Caleb looked around the cabin. The cold walls. The quiet. The place that had been slowly dying around him for 3 years and had somehow not finished the job. "What I've built here," he said quietly, "has been a tomb for a while now. Maybe it's time I used it for something else." Abigail didn't speak. He went to the stove and put a kettle on. "You should sleep more," he said. "We'll talk strategy when you can sit up without going gray in the face." A long pause. Then softly, "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." "Caleb," he said. "You already used it once. Might as well keep going." And somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the fear and the weight of everything she was still carrying, Abigail Vale's mouth curved toward something that looked just slightly like the beginning of trust. Outside, the wind moved through Briar Hollow. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, the cabin felt like it held something besides grief. She slept through most of the second day, and Caleb let her. He had work to do, always had work to do on a ranch, even one that had been slowly going quiet around him. But he found himself moving closer to the cabin than usual, checking the road more than he needed to, listening for horses the way a man listens when he knows something is coming and doesn't know exactly when. Around mid-afternoon, he heard her moving inside. He came in to find her sitting upright on the cot, her back straight, her chin level, working through something in her mind that had put hard lines around her mouth. She looked up when the door opened. She didn't flinch. That was the first thing he noticed about her. She had stopped flinching when he came through the door. It had only been a day, and she had stopped flinching. "You should still be lying down," he said. "I've been lying down for 20 hours. You were bleeding for 3 days before that." "I'm aware." She shifted on the cot. "Sit down. I need to tell you something." He sat. "The ledger page inside the wrapping," she said. "It lists payments made to Sheriff Rusk over 14 months, names of the men paying him amounts, dates. The payments began 1 month after a woman named Clara Jeffs filed a complaint against the freight owners and then disappeared." She held his gaze. Clara was 19. She'd been working at the freight office for 7 months. When she disappeared, Rusk told the town she'd gone back east to family. She had no family east or anywhere else. Caleb didn't move. "There's also a letter," Abigail continued, "in Clara's handwriting. She gave it to me 6 weeks before she disappeared, told me to keep it somewhere safe, told me if anything happened to her, I should know that Rusk had already warned her to stop talking. That letter names the 3 men who died in that freight office." She paused. "It names what they did to her." "Where did you get the ledger?" "I worked as a bookkeeper," she said. 3 years for a freight company in Garnet. I did the accounts with my feet. I was faster and more accurate than the man before me, and they paid me half what they paid him. And they thought that was fair, because what else was I going to do?" Her voice didn't rise. It just went flat, in that particular way of a woman reciting facts she has had a long time to make peace with. When I started seeing entries that didn't match any legitimate expense, I started keeping copies, a page at a time, over 8 months. They didn't notice. They didn't think I was capable of noticing, she said. That was always the mistake people made. Caleb leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees. So Rusk knows exactly what you're carrying, he said. He knows I have the ledger page. He knows about Clara's letter because he was there when she handed it to me. He'd been watching her. What he doesn't know. She stopped, just briefly. Is that I also have payment records from the county land office. Rusk wasn't only covering for the freight men. He's been helping someone buy up homestead claims illegally. Women who were widowed women whose husbands defaulted. Someone has been acquiring that land at a fraction of its value through a proxy company, and Rusk has been filing the paperwork to make it look clean. The silence stretched. That's bigger than 3 dead men, Caleb said. Yes. Who's behind the land acquisition? Abigail looked at him steadily. A man named Harold Crane. He owns the mill, 2 of the largest cattle contracts in the county, and he's on the board of the Territorial Bank. Caleb went very still. Crane, he said. You know him. His wife is Lydia Crane. He stood up and moved to the window, not looking at anything, just needing to move. She runs the women's social at the church. She brought food to this ranch for 6 months after my wife died. He stopped. She's not a bad woman. No, Abigail said quietly. She probably isn't. That doesn't mean her husband isn't. Caleb stood at the window for a long moment. The kettle on the stove started to whistle, and he moved to pull it off without thinking, the kind of automatic motion of a man who has lived alone long enough that small tasks have become reflexes. Did Lydia know? He asked. I don't know, Abigail said honestly. I don't think she'd want to. He poured water into 2 cups and brought one to her, setting it on the floor the same way he had the day before. She had stopped looking uncomfortable when he did it that way. That was the second thing he'd noticed, how quickly she had adjusted to a man who simply found the practical solution without making it something she had to be grateful for. I went to Rusk 3 months ago, she said, wrapping her toes around the cup and lifting it. I showed him the first ledger page, just the first one, as a warning. I told him I had more, and that I intended to take it to the county judge in Millhaven. She drank, set the cup back. He laughed. He actually laughed. He said the judge was his cousin's father-in-law, and I was welcome to try. Then he said, if I set foot outside of Garnet with any papers related to his office, he would have me declared incompetent and institutionalized within the week. He said there wasn't a jury in Montana that would take the word of a deformed woman over the word of a decorated lawman. He was probably right about the jury, Caleb said. He was completely right about the jury, Abigail said. That's why I didn't go to the jury. Then who were you going to? She looked at him. Reverend Bell in Carver Falls. He's not under Rusk's jurisdiction. He corresponds directly with the territorial governor's office, I'd confirm that. And he's the kind of man who reads a document before he decides what to believe. She paused. I was 2 days' ride from Carver Falls when Rusk's men found me on the Millhaven Road. They shot you. One of them did, yes. Her voice was even. I got away because my horse panicked and went off the road into the tree line, and they couldn't follow in the dark. I rode until the horse gave out, then I walked. She looked down at the cot. I don't know how long I walked. Caleb thought about that. About a woman with no arms, shot in the ribs, walking through February in Montana, carrying evidence against the sheriff pressed against her bleeding side. Why didn't you go to anyone in town, he said, when you were walking? Because everyone in Garnet knows my face, and the towns between Garnet and here, I couldn't risk it. Rusk has reach. She met his eyes. I saw your barn from the road. I thought it was empty. I was going to sleep in the hay and keep moving before sunrise. A pause. Then I fell. And I found you. And you found me. She agreed. He sat back down in his chair. All right, he said. Reverend Bell in Carver Falls, that's still the plan. If you'll help me get there. It's 4 days' ride in this weather, you can't ride yet. I know that. And Rusk will be watching the roads. I know that too. Caleb drummed his fingers once on his knee, then stopped. Then we don't go to Bell, he said. We bring Bell here. Abigail frowned. How? I've got a hand who rides supply runs to Carver Falls twice a month. His name is Pete Aldridge. He's 63 years old. He's been with this ranch since before my wife died, and Thomas Rusk once tried to fine him for watering his horse at a public trough, and Pete told him exactly what he could do with his fine in front of 12 witnesses. Caleb almost smiled. Pete doesn't like the sheriff, and Pete can keep his mouth shut. You trust him? With my life. Have before. Abigail was quiet for a moment. And the Reverend, you trust him? I don't know Bell well, but what you said about him corresponding with the governor's office, I can verify that. Pete would know. When does Pete ride next? He was supposed to go out day after tomorrow, if I send him early. The sound came without warning. 3 sharp knocks on the cabin door. Not the pounding of a lawman. Quieter, more deliberate. Caleb was on his feet before the 3rd knock finished. He crossed to the cot in 2 steps and looked at Abigail, and she was already moving, shifting to the edge of the cot, her face set and white. Under the floorboards, he said quietly. Same place as before. Can you manage? Yes, she said, and she meant it. He'd already learned that when Abigail Vale said yes, she meant it. No softening, no false confidence, just yes. He helped her down without touching the wrapping, then lifted the boards and settled them back into place while she steadied herself below. He crossed to the door, took a breath, and opened it. Pete Aldridge stood on the step, hat in his hands, his face carrying the particular careful expression of a man who has seen something he's still deciding how to handle. Boss, Pete said. Pete, I was riding in from the east pasture. Pete looked past Caleb's shoulder for just a moment, then back. Saw Sheriff Rusk's men on the ridge, 2 of them glassing the ranch with a long scope. Caleb held the door, kept his face still. How long? He said. Long enough to have seen the smoke from your stove. Pete turned his hat in his hands. And I found something else. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, a wanted poster newer than the one Rusk had shown that morning, the ink still dark and sharp. They're posting these in every direction. Garnet Millhaven, Carver Falls, everywhere. $50 now, not $20. Reward doubled sometime today. Caleb took the paper. He didn't look at it. Come inside, Pete, he said. Pete came in. His eyes moved to the cot immediately, the rumpled blanket, the 2 cups on the floor, the linen strips drying by the stove. He was 63 years old and had been working ranches since he was 14, and he was not a man who missed things. I need you to ride to Carver Falls, Caleb said. Tomorrow at first light. Not your usual supply run. Ride straight to the church and ask for Reverend Bell. Pete's eyes moved back to him. Steady. Waiting. Tell him Caleb Mercer has something that needs to reach the territorial governor's office. Tell him it's urgent and it can't be moved. Tell him... Caleb paused. Tell him a woman has been carrying the truth a long way, and she needs someone to meet her halfway. Pete was quiet for a count of 3. This about the woman they're hunting, he said. She's here. Pete looked at the floor for a moment. Just the floor. A long, thoughtful look that said he was doing math in his head and checking the answer twice. All right, he said finally. I'll ride at first light. Caleb let out a slow breath. Boss, Pete said, putting his hat back on. Those men on the ridge, they're going to report that you've got smoke at your home, that everything looks normal. He paused at the door. But they're going to come back, and next time it won't be 2 men with a scope. I know, Caleb said. You know what you're doing. Caleb looked at him. Pete, he said. I found her in the mud by the barn, shot in the ribs, carrying evidence against the county sheriff inside her wrapping. She walked through the night with no arms and no help, and she didn't quit. He paused. I know exactly what I'm doing. Pete nodded once, slowly. Good enough for me, he said and left. Caleb waited until the hoofbeats faded, then lifted the floorboard. Abigail pulled herself up and sat on the edge of the opening, and he reached down to help her out, not touching the wrapping, steadying her by the shoulder, the way she'd let him that morning, and she was breathing hard, her face tight, the wound in her ribs pulling at the effort. "You heard," he said. "All of it." She settled back onto the cot. $50. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, she agreed. She looked at him. You could still... No, he said, simply, finally, the way a man says something that isn't open for discussion anymore. She looked away. Then she said quietly, "Tell me about your wife." It landed like something unexpected. He sat down. "Why?" he said, not defensive, genuinely asking. "Because you said this ranch has been a tomb, and you said it the way a man says something he's been thinking for a long time." She looked back at him. "And because you've been kind to me in ways that don't come from nowhere. That kind of care, the specific kind, the kind that knows to hold the cup a certain way to ask before touching, that doesn't come from a man who has never loved anyone." Caleb was quiet. "Her name was May," he said. "She was..." He stopped. Tried again. "She was funny. That's what people don't say about her when they talk about her, because she died young and people make saints out of the dead. But she was genuinely funny, quick-witted. She'd have said something sharp about this whole situation that would have made both of us laugh." "When did she die?" 3 years and 4 months ago. He didn't have to calculate it. She was pregnant, 7 months along. There were complications, and then there were more complications, and then... He pressed his hands together. The baby girl died first, then May 2 days later. The doctor said May knew the baby was gone before she went. She never cried once after that. She just went quiet. And then she was gone. Abigail didn't offer anything soft or consoling. She didn't say she was sorry. Didn't say it wasn't his fault. Didn't fill the silence with the usual shapes people pour into grief. She just let it be what it was. "The town," he said after a while. There were whispers. About the baby. That something was wrong with her before she came. That maybe it was in the blood in the family, something that May passed. He exhaled. None of it was true. But whispers don't need to be true to do damage. "No," Abigail said quietly. "They don't. I think that's part of why I..." He stopped. "Why you didn't hand me to the sheriff," she said. He looked at her. "I know what it is," he said, "to have people decide what you are before they know a single true thing about you." The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the wind was picking up again, pressing against the walls of the cabin, with a sound that was almost conversational, like something trying to get in and not quite making it. Abigail shifted. Then she said, "My mother used to wrap me at night. The cloth. It wasn't to hide me from herself. She wasn't ashamed of me. She did it because the cold was hard on me as an infant, and the wrapping helped." She looked down at herself. "I kept doing it when she was gone. It felt safe, like..." She stopped. People see what they expect to see. When they see the cloth first, they see a woman. When they see me, they see... "A woman," Caleb said. She looked up. "That's what I see," he said. "In case you were wondering." A long pause. Something shifted in Abigail's face, not dramatically, not the way it shifted in the dime novels that Caleb had read as a boy, where women wept at kindness. It was smaller than that. It was the shift of someone who had been holding something tightly for a very long time, and had just carefully eased their grip by a fraction. "You're dangerous, Caleb Mercer," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Because I cook eggs. Because you're the first man in my adult life," she said, "who has treated my body as though it belongs to me." He had no answer for that, so he didn't try for one. He got up and added wood to the stove, and the fire jumped higher, and Abigail leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside, the wind pressed and released. Then Pete knocked twice on the cabin wall, his signal, the one that meant all clear, and Caleb relaxed into his chair and let himself breathe. "Get some sleep," he told her. "I'm not tired." "You're exhausted." That's different from tired. But her voice was already slowing. Caleb. The men on the ridge. I know. If they report back to Rusk tonight, then we move faster, he said. Sleep. We'll need you sharp tomorrow. She was quiet for another moment. The ledger, she said. If anything happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you. Caleb. Her voice sharpened. I'm serious. If anything happens to me, the cloth is sewn into a false hem on the left side. Press inward from the edge, there's a seam that doesn't hold. The ledger page folds out from there, then the letter, then the land records behind it. She paused. Reverend Bell will know what to do with them. He looked at her. I'm not going to need that information, he said. But you have it, she said. But I have it, he agreed. She closed her eyes. He sat in his chair and watched the fire and listened to the wind and thought about a sheriff with $50 on a woman's head and 2 men on a ridge with a long scope. And he thought about Pete riding at first light, and he thought about May and what she would have said, probably something sharp and funny and completely accurate about the situation, and underneath all of it, quiet, and certain he thought about the woman on his cot who had walked through a February night with no arms and a bullet in her ribs, and every reason in the world to quit and hadn't. He thought about that for a long time. Then, near midnight, when he was nearly asleep in his chair, Abigail spoke from the cot in the darkness. Caleb, she said, soft, almost like she wasn't sure she meant to say it out loud. Still here, he said. A long pause. Pain took her, she said. Not you. He recognized his wife's name shaped in her voice. Not May's name, but the wound. The specific wound, the one she had identified 2 days ago with the accuracy of someone who understood what it was to carry something that had no clean edges. He didn't answer for a moment. I know, he said. The same way a man says something that isn't open for discussion anymore. Not because it was finished. Grief didn't finish. But because he'd finally said it out loud to another person, and it had landed in the room, and the room had held it. The wind pressed against the walls. The fire burned low. Abigail Vale slept on Caleb Mercer's cot wrapped in gray cloth carrying the truth against her side, and for the first time in 3 years, Briar Hollow felt like something other than a place where things ended. Pete rode out before the sun touched the ridge. Caleb heard the hooves and didn't get up. He'd been awake for 2 hours already, sitting in his chair with cold coffee and a rifle across his knees, listening to the quiet, the way a man listens when quiet has stopped being safe. Abigail was asleep. Her breathing had steadied overnight, deeper, slower, the fever heat in her skin finally dropping toward something close to normal. The wound was holding. That was the first piece of good news Briar Hollow had produced in 3 days, and Caleb held on to it. He checked the road through the window. Empty. The ridge where Pete had spotted the 2 men with the scope also empty as far as he could tell in the gray before dawn light. That didn't mean they were gone. It meant they'd moved to somewhere he couldn't see them, which was different and worse. Abigail woke up an hour after Pete left. He's gone, she said. Before sunrise. He'll make good time. She sat up on her own, her jaw tight with the effort, but her back straight. She'd been doing that more managing things before he could offer. He'd noticed she did it without performance, without the aggressive self-sufficiency of someone proving a point. She just did it because she could, and she didn't need him to register it. Rusk will have men on the Carver Falls Road, she said. Pete knows 3 ways to Carver Falls that aren't the road, Caleb said. He's been riding this territory for 40 years. Rusk's men are from Garnet. They don't know the land the way Pete does. She absorbed that, nodded once. How long before he reaches Bell? If the weather holds, he'll be there by nightfall. If Bell agrees to come. Caleb paused. 2 days, maybe 3. We have 2 days, she said. Maybe less. I know. She looked at him with that direct, measuring look she had, the one that wasn't challenging, just honest. You should know something. The land records I mentioned, the illegal acquisitions through Crane's proxy company. 3 of those claims are within 15 miles of this ranch. Caleb went very still. What? The Hendersons' old place to the north. the Purcell widow's parcel east of your fence line, and the Garrett homestead that went up for tax claim last spring. She held his gaze. All three absorbed by Crane's proxy in the last 18 months. All three filed through Rusk's office. Caleb stood up from the chair. He walked to the window. He didn't look at anything in particular. He was doing what she'd watched him do before moving, because staying still while processing something large wasn't possible for him. He was a physical man in the way that men of the land were physical, not aggressive, but grounded, his thinking connected to his body in ways that required movement. "He's building a corridor," Caleb said. "Yes. He gets those 3 parcels plus what he already holds to the south. He controls the entire water access between Garnet and Millhaven. And every rancher between those 2 towns becomes dependent on his goodwill for grazing rights," Abigail said. "Including you." He turned around. "How close was he to Briar Hollow?" "The last land record I found was dated November. Your ranch was not yet on the list." She paused. "But the survey notes in Crane's file included a property description that matches your eastern boundary." The words landed like something cold. "He was coming for this place," Caleb said. "Eventually, yes." He stood there for a moment, and then something shifted in his face. Not anger exactly, something quieter and more settled than anger, the look of a man who has just understood that the thing he thought he was doing out of principle has also been all along the practical and necessary thing. "All right," he said. "Then we're not just getting you to safety, we're taking the whole thing down." "That was always the plan," Abigail said. "You knew about Briar Hollow before you fell in my yard. I knew Briar Hollow was on Crane's list. I didn't know whose ranch it was." She met his eyes steadily. "When you told me your name, I recognized it from the survey notes. I debated telling you. Why didn't you tell me that first night?" "Because you were a stranger with a rifle, and I was bleeding on your floor," she said evenly. "I told you what I needed to tell you to stay alive. I'm telling you the rest now because you've earned it." The fire in the stove popped hard. Neither of them moved. "Fair enough," Caleb said finally. He crossed back to the chair and sat down and looked at her. Really looked at her the way he hadn't let himself look before, not because he was avoiding her, but because looking directly at people was something he'd gotten out of the habit of in 3 years of living alone. Abigail Vale was 32 years old and had spent most of those years being underestimated by people who mistook limitation for weakness, and the result was a woman with the specific hardened clarity of someone who had learned to see everything because she could never afford to miss anything. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Not for survival, for the plan. What do you need?" She didn't hesitate. "I need 3 witnesses who aren't afraid of Rusk. I need them here before Bell arrives, so that when Bell reads the documents, there are already local names attached to what was heard. Rusk can challenge a reverend from another town. He can't challenge his own neighbors." "Who do you have in mind? You tell me who in this county has reason to stand against Thomas Rusk and the backbone to do it." Caleb thought. "Jonah Reed, the blacksmith in Carver Falls. He's refused Rusk's inspections twice and won both disputes. He's not afraid of the badge." He paused. "Reverend Bell himself could serve as a witness as well as a carrier. And—" He stopped. "And—" she pressed. "Lydia Crane," he said. Abigail looked at him sharply. "Crane's wife," he said. "I know, but listen. If Lydia Crane stands in that room and hears what her husband has been doing, if she hears it from a reverend in front of witnesses with documents, she becomes either the most important witness we have or she runs straight to Harold and we lose everything." He held her gaze. "But if she's there and she stands a woman everyone in this county trusts the wife of the man at the center of this nothing Rusk says afterward holds. You'd risk the whole thing on whether Lydia Crane has more loyalty to truth than to her husband." "I'd risk it on whether she's the woman I think she is," Caleb said. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You liked her. She was kind to me when May died. Real kind, not the kind that's about being seen being kind. She sat with me for 2 hours one afternoon and didn't say a single useless thing." He paused. That kind of woman doesn't become that way by practicing ignorance. She became that way by paying attention. And I think she's been paying attention to her husband for a long time and not liking what she sees. Another silence. The wind moved outside. Someone, a bird maybe, or a branch, struck the side of the cabin once and then was quiet. "All right," Abigail said. "But she comes last. Bring Reed first. And how do you reach them without Rusk knowing?" "I don't leave the ranch," Caleb said. "But I know who does." He got up and went to the door and whistled 2 short notes, 1 long. 20 seconds later, a teenage boy appeared from the direction of the barn. 14 years old, slight, quick-eyed, with the wiry alertness of a kid who had learned early that being useful was the best protection available. "Daniel," Caleb said, "I need you to ride." Daniel Marsh, Pete's grandson, who spent 3 months of every year at Briar Hollow, learning the ranch work his grandfather had promised to teach him, stepped inside and looked at Abigail without a flicker of surprise. Caleb had explained the previous evening in the particular calm and direct way that he handled things. He needed the boy to understand. "There's a woman here, she's hurt, she's in trouble, that isn't her fault, and you don't tell anyone she's here." Daniel had nodded once and gone back to the barn. Now Daniel looked at Abigail, and then at Caleb and said, "Where am I riding?" "Jonah Reed in Carver Falls," Caleb said. "You know his shop?" "Yes, sir." "Tell him Caleb Mercer needs him at Briar Hollow, day after tomorrow before sunrise. Tell him to come quiet and come alone." Caleb paused. "Can you remember that exactly?" "Day after tomorrow before sunrise, quiet and alone," Daniel repeated without blinking. "Good. Then you ride to Mrs. Crane's house, not the mill, not Harold Crane's office, Mrs. Crane's house, and you give her this." He crossed to the shelf above the fireplace and took down a small leather-bound book, May's old journal, which he'd never opened since she died. He turned to the back page, which was blank, and wrote 4 sentences in his careful, slow hand. Folded it, handed it to Daniel. "You don't open that," he said. "You put it in her hands and no one else's. If Harold Crane is home, you wait. If Rusk's men are watching the house, you come back and tell me." Daniel took the folded page with both hands. "Yes, sir," he said, and was gone. Abigail looked at the door after the boy left. "What did you write to her?" Caleb sat back down. "The truth. That I have evidence her husband has been stealing land from widows with the sheriff's help. That I have documents. That I need her to decide what kind of woman she wants to be when this is over." "She might warn him." "She might," Caleb agreed. "But she brought 3 meals to this ranch every week for 4 months after May died, and she never once mentioned Harold, never asked what he was building, never talked about the mill or the land deals or any of it. She talked about May. She talked about the garden May had wanted to plant and never got to." He looked at the fire. "A woman who tends grief that carefully is a woman who knows the difference between what she's supposed to protect and what deserves protecting." Abigail said nothing for a long moment. "You're either very perceptive," she said finally, "or very lucky." "Both times I've needed it most," Caleb said. "It's been some of both." The next 36 hours moved the way hours move, when everyone involved is waiting for something that can't be hurried. Caleb tended the ranch with the mechanical discipline of a man keeping routine, because routine was the only camouflage available. Abigail mended not passively, not in the way of someone waiting to be rescued, but actively spending hours working through the details of the documents she carried, rehearsing every name and date aloud until they were no longer just evidence, but testimony. She could deliver without the papers if she had to. Caleb listened. He asked questions. He pushed back when her logic had gaps, and she sharpened her answers until there were no gaps. They worked it like 2 people building something that had to hold weight, going over every joint until it was sound. By the second evening, Abigail could sit upright for 4 hours without her face going gray. By the morning of the 3rd day, she was moving around the cabin. Not easily, the wound still pulled sharp when she turned wrong, but moving. Present. Alive in a way she hadn't been when he'd found her in the mud. That 3rd morning, Daniel came back. He slipped in through the back the way Caleb had told him to return, and his face was carrying news that he hadn't sorted yet into good or bad. "Reed said yes," he said first. "He'll be here before sunrise tomorrow." Caleb let out a breath. "And Mrs. Crane?" Daniel's face did something complicated. She read the letter twice. Then she asked me to wait outside. I waited maybe 20 minutes. Then she came back and she'd been crying, but she wasn't crying anymore, and she said— He paused, making sure he had it exactly right. She said, "Tell Caleb Mercer she'll be there." Abigail, from the cot where she was sitting up, closed her eyes for just a moment. Caleb pressed his hand flat against the table. One breath. Then, "Anyone see you?" "I was careful, like you said. I took the creek road both ways. No one saw me." Daniel paused. "But Mr. Mercer?" "On my way back on the ridge east of the property, I counted 5 men. Not 2 anymore. 5. And one of them was wearing a deputy's badge." The room went quiet. 5 men on a ridge meant Rusk wasn't waiting for a complaint anymore. 5 men meant he'd already decided what was going to happen at Briar Hollow, and he'd just been waiting until the numbers felt safe enough to move. "Tonight," Abigail said. "Maybe," Caleb said. "Or he waits until he thinks we're asleep." "He'll come before Belle arrives," she said. "He has to. If Belle gets here first." "He knows that," Caleb said. "He's always known. He's been watching this ranch long enough to know Pete rode to Carver Falls. He knows what that means." He looked at Daniel. "Go back to the barn. Keep the horses ready, both of them. If I call for you, you ride for Carver Falls as fast as that horse will carry you, and you don't stop." Daniel nodded, didn't argue, left. Abigail stood up from the cot. She stood with her back straight and her chin level, and the gray cloth wrapping settled around her, and she looked at Caleb across the small firelit room with an expression he had never seen on her before. Not fear, not determination exactly, but the specific clarity of a person who has decided something irrevocable and is now at peace with the decision. "I want to be in the room when Rusk comes," she said. "Abigail, I'm not hiding under the floorboards again," she said. "I've been hiding for 3 months. I've been hiding my whole life in ways that had nothing to do with Rusk and everything to do with what people decide about me before I open my mouth." Her voice was even, absolutely even. "If he comes tonight, I want to be sitting in that chair when the door opens." Caleb looked at her. "He'll have armed men," he said. "I know. He might not give us time to—" "Caleb?" She said his name the way she'd said it that first morning, like a line drawn. "The evidence in this cloth is useless if I'm dead or locked in an asylum. The only version of this that ends with Rusk destroyed is the version where I'm present and speaking and alive, and in full view of every witness in this room." She paused. "You know that." He did know that. He had known it for 2 days, and he'd been not saying it because there was a difference between knowing something and saying it out loud to the woman it would put directly in danger. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated. And then quietly, "Don't reach for your rifle first. Let me talk to him first. Whatever he says, whatever he threatens, let me go first. You think you can get a confession out of Thomas Rusk. I think Thomas Rusk has spent 20 years being the most powerful man in every room he walks into," she said. "I think he has never once been genuinely challenged by someone he considered beneath him. And I think when he walks through that door and sees me sitting in that chair, uncovered, unashamed, looking directly at him, he's going to be so angry that he forgets to be careful." Caleb studied her face. "You've been planning this," he said. "Not just since you got here. Longer. Since the night I walked out of that freight office," she said. "I had a choice. Run forever or pick the ground and stand on it." She looked at the floor for just a moment. "I kept running because I needed the documents to mean something. I needed witnesses. I needed a room." She looked back up. "You gave me all 3. He had nothing to say to that. So he went to the window and checked the ridge, still 5 shapes, still watching, and then he turned around and started to arrange the room. He moved the chairs. He pulled the small table to one side. He checked the cellar passage and left the latch unbolted, the passage they'd discussed 2 days ago, the one that ran beneath the cabin floor and opened behind the woodpile. Big enough for 2 people. Big enough for 3. And then he did one more thing. The thing he'd been thinking about since Daniel came back with Lydia Crane's answer. He went to the door and signaled 3 short knocks on the outer wall. An answering knock came from behind the woodpile. Jonah Reed had arrived 4 hours early. Abigail turned from the stove where she'd been standing. "He's here already." "Reed doesn't do anything late," Caleb said. "And then Lydia is with him." Abigail went still. "She came early too." "Apparently." He opened the door. Jonah Reed was a broad man, built the way men who work iron are built, with careful eyes and hands that stayed quiet at his sides. Beside him, Lydia Crane was smaller than Caleb remembered, or maybe she just seemed smaller because she was holding herself very carefully, the way people hold themselves when they've recently made a decision that cost them something and haven't finished paying for it yet. Her eyes were dry and direct, and when she looked at Abigail, she didn't look away. "Miss Vale," Lydia said. Abigail looked back at her. Neither woman spoke for a moment. The silence between them had texture. It held Lydia's letter of refusal from 3 months ago. It held every door that had been closed in Abigail's face. It held everything that had been chosen over her when choosing her would have cost something. "Mrs. Crane," Abigail said finally. Lydia stepped forward. "I owe you an apology that isn't worth the air it takes to say it," she said quietly. "But I'm here now. And I brought Harold's ledger book from his office safe." She reached into her coat and produced a small book, edges worn pages thick. "I've known the combination for 11 years. He never thought to change it because he never thought I'd use it." She set the ledger on the table between them. Abigail looked at it, then at Lydia, then at Caleb. "Get them into the cellar passage," Abigail said. Her voice had changed sharper, faster, the voice of someone shifting from planning to execution. "Read Mrs. Crane, both of you. Now, Caleb." She turned to him. "Send Daniel to the ridge to watch. The moment Rusk moves toward this cabin, I need to know." "You want to do this tonight?" Caleb said. "Not a question. We have 2 witnesses, a ledger from Harold Crane's own safe and a sheriff who is standing on a ridge right now deciding when to come burn this place down." She looked at him steadily. "We don't wait for morning. We finish this tonight." He looked at Lydia Crane and Jonah Reed, one resolute one, still both ready, and then he looked at Abigail Vale, who had walked through February with a bullet in her ribs, and was now standing in his cabin preparing to face the man who'd put it there. He went to the door and whistled for Daniel. Not because he had run out of objections. Because she was right, and he knew it, and sometimes knowing someone is right is exactly the same as trusting them. Outside, the ridge was quiet, but not for long. Daniel's knock came 40 minutes later. 3 fast raps on the cabin wall, the signal they'd agreed on, the one that meant movement on the ridge. Caleb crossed to the cellar passage and crouched down. "Read. Mrs. Crane. Stay quiet and stay down. Don't come up until I open that latch myself. You understand?" Jonah Reed's voice came back low and steady. "Understood." Lydia Crane said nothing, but her hand reached up through the gap and pressed briefly against Caleb's wrist. Not a plea, not fear. Steadiness. He closed the latch. He straightened and looked at Abigail. She was already in the chair. Upright. Unwrapped from the shoulder down, the gray cloth folded across her lap, her body uncovered and unashamed in the firelight in a way he had not seen before. She had made the choice deliberately. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the specific quality of her stillness. She wasn't braced. She was settled. There was a difference. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's the point." He went to the window. 5 shapes coming off the ridge, moving fast, spreading to flank the cabin. One of them carrying something long and dark that wasn't a rifle, an oil can. Caleb's hand went to the rifle against the wall. "Don't," Abigail said. He turned. "I told you," she said. "Let me go first. Whatever he comes in with, let me go first. If you raise that rifle, you're a man protecting a wanted woman, and he gets to write that story. If you put it down, he has to write a different one." Her eyes were absolutely steady. "Trust me." Caleb looked at her for one long moment. Then he moved the rifle 2 steps to the left and leaned it against the wall, still within reach, but not in his hands. The boots hit the porch. The door came open hard. Thomas Rusk walked in with 2 deputies behind him and a face that had already decided how this was going to end. He was wearing his full badge and his good coat, the coat he wore when he wanted to remind people what he represented. His eyes moved across the cabin, fast standard lawman sweep cataloging threat, and then landed on Caleb, and then shifted and found Abigail sitting in the chair. He stopped. Whatever he had expected to walk into it wasn't this. "Miss Vale," he said. His voice landed flat and careful. "Sheriff Rusk," Abigail said. Her voice came out clear and unhurried in the way of a woman who has rehearsed nothing because she doesn't need to. Rusk looked at Caleb. "Mercer, step away from the woman." "I'm right where I want to be," Caleb said. "You're obstructing a lawful arrest." "I don't see a warrant," Caleb said. Rusk reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Signed yesterday by Judge—" "Which judge?" Abigail said. Rusk looked at her. "You said signed by a judge," she said. "Which one?" "That is not your concern." "Marcus Holt," she said. "The judge in Garnet. Your brother-in-law's business partner." She said it the way she'd recited names and dates for 2 days, without heat, without accusation, just fact lying flat on the table where everyone in the room could see it. "That warrant isn't valid outside Garnet jurisdiction. You're 30 miles outside Garnet jurisdiction, Sheriff." One of the deputies looked at Rusk. Rusk's jaw tightened. "A territorial warrant would require the territorial marshal's signature," Abigail said. "Does it have one?" Silence. She already knew it didn't. She'd known the moment she saw the document because Rusk wouldn't have gone to the territorial marshal. The territorial marshal had no reason to protect him. "You're going to come with me," Rusk said. Low now, the public voice gone. "And you're going to do it quietly, and whatever you think you have in that cloth is going to burn in this fire before we leave this property." "The ledger," Abigail said. "You mean the ledger page showing 14 months of payments from 3 freight owners to your personal account? The one with your name, your account number at the Garnet Bank, and 16 separate entries." She paused. "Or do you mean Clara Jeffs' letter? The one she wrote 6 weeks before she disappeared, naming you specifically, stating that you warned her to stop filing complaints, or you'd make sure she couldn't file anything ever again." The second deputy had stopped moving. He was standing very still, with his hand near his sidearm, and his face doing the calculation that men do when they realize the ground they're standing on has changed. "Or the land records," Abigail continued, and her voice didn't rise by a single degree. "Harold Crane's proxy acquisitions, the Henderson parcel, the Purcell widow's land, the Garrett homestead, all filed through your office, all signed by your hand, all transferred at illegal fractions of fair value to a company that exists only on paper and pays its profits into an account that Harold Crane's mill manager confirmed in writing belongs to a trust with your name on it." Rusk crossed the floor in 4 steps and grabbed the edge of the table with both hands, leaning over it toward her. "You don't have any of that," he said. "You have a page you stole from a private ledger and a dead girl's letter that proves nothing." "I have all of it," Abigail said. She did not move. She did not lean back. She looked up at him from 2 feet away with the steadiness of a woman who has been this close to the thing that wanted to destroy her for 3 months and has decided she is done moving backward. "And I have Harold Crane's own ledger book, which Mrs. Crane retrieved from his office safe this evening, which contains his private records of every payment made to your trust account over 22 months. Rusk went still. "Mrs. Crane," he said, very quietly. "Yes," Abigail said. "She's here." "That's—" He straightened. His face was doing something complicated, the public confidence cracking along lines that had always been there, hidden under the badge and the good coat and 20 years of being believed. "She wouldn't. Lydia wouldn't." "She already did," Caleb said from across the room. Rusk turned on him. "Whatever she told you, Whatever she thinks she found, a woman doesn't understand her husband's business accounts. She doesn't know what she's reading. I understood mine for 8 years, Abigail said, and I trained Lydia Crane myself. That landed in the room like something physical. Rusk looked back at her. You trained her, he said. 2 years ago. She asked me to teach her to read a ledger properly because her husband's bookkeeper had retired and Harold wouldn't hire a replacement. She learned fast. Abigail paused. She's been reading Harold's private accounts for 18 months. She knew before I did. She just didn't know what to do with what she knew. The second deputy took a quiet step backward toward the door. Harper, Rusk said sharply without looking. Stay where you are. Sheriff? Stay. The deputy stayed. But his hand had moved away from his sidearm, and that meant something. It meant he was calculating his own survival, now not Rusk's authority. Rusk turned back to Abigail. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something private and deliberate. The voice of a man who has put down the public tool and picked up the private one. You want to be believed, he said. I understand that. I do. But you are a woman with no arms who is wanted for murder. The moment I walk you into any courtroom in this territory, that is what the jury will see. Not the ledger, not the letter. You. He let that sit for a moment. And I will personally testify that you were unstable, that you threatened these men for months before their deaths, that you are precisely the kind of person who, what? Abigail said, who cannot be trusted to understand what she's seen. Because I have no arms. Because you are compromised, he said. By grief, by isolation, by a condition that has what? Her voice was still even, still steady. Prevented me from keeping accurate financial records for 12 years across 4 different companies. Prevented me from identifying fraudulent entries that your paid accountant missed for 2 years running. Prevented me from gathering, organizing, and preserving documentary evidence of your crimes across 8 months without losing a single page. She looked at him. That condition, Sheriff. Rusk's mouth tightened. The payments, she said. Let's talk about those specifically. September 1885. $40 from the account of Gerald Marsh, freight owner, logged as a consulting fee. No consulting services were rendered. October 1885. $60 from the same account, logged as a legal administrative charge. Your office does not charge administrative fees. I confirmed that with the county clerk's records. November 1885. Stop, Rusk said. December 1885, $120. I said stop. From 2 separate accounts logged as. I know what they're logged as. It came out hot and fast, the way things come out when a man has spent so long managing his own narrative that having someone read it back to him in plain language breaks something loose. I know every entry in that ledger. You think I don't know I signed off on those entries myself? He stopped. The room was absolutely silent. Rusk heard what he'd just said in the same moment everyone else did. He turned his head slowly first to the first deputy who was looking at the floor, then to the second who had taken another step toward the door, then to Caleb who was standing with his arms loose at his sides and his face carrying the particular stillness of a man who is going to remember this exact moment for the rest of his life. Then the cellar latch clicked. Rusk spun toward the sound. The floor panel lifted. Jonah Reed came up first, his big frame filling the opening, his face set and grave. Behind him, Lydia Crane climbed out of the passage with Harold's ledger book pressed against her chest, and her eyes finding Rusk immediately, not with triumph, not with anger, with something much quieter and much harder than either of those things. Thomas, she said. Rusk looked at her the way a man looks at something that should not exist. Lydia, I heard everything, she said. So did Jonah, and Reverend Bell arrived an hour ago. He's outside with Daniel. She set Harold's ledger on the table beside Abigail. He's been outside since before you came down off that ridge. Rusk looked at the door. I wouldn't, Caleb said quietly. One of the deputies, the first one, The one who had stayed put reached up and unpinned his own badge from his coat. Set it on the floor by his boot. Then he stepped back against the wall and put his hands where everyone could see them. Rusk watched him do it. "You're all—" He turned around once, taking in the room: Abigail in the chair, Caleb by the wall, Reed and Lydia by the cellar, the documents on the table, the deputy who had just quit his job by setting his badge on the floor. "This doesn't end here. You think a reverend and a blacksmith and a—" He looked at Abigail. "You think any of this holds without a court, without a judge who isn't already bought?" "The territorial governor's office," Abigail said. "Bell has been corresponding with them directly for 3 years. He has a contact in Helena who handles corruption complaints against county officials." She paused. "Bell wrote here with 2 letters already written. One for the governor's office, one for the territorial marshal in Missoula. They go out by morning post." Rusk stared at her. "You planned this room," he said. Not a question. Understanding arriving too late the way it does. "I planned this room," she said. "From the moment your men shot me on the Millhaven Road. I just needed to find it." He looked at Caleb. "You let her use your ranch." "Gratefully," Caleb said. Rusk stood in the middle of the cabin floor, with nowhere left to stand that wasn't already claimed by something he couldn't fight, and the badge on his chest had stopped meaning what it meant, and the coat that said respectable had stopped saying it. And for the first time in 20 years, Thomas Rusk was just a man in a room who had been caught by a woman he had never once taken seriously. "Sit down, Sheriff," Abigail said. He looked at her. "Sit down," she said again, "and we'll do this the right way. No more running, no more burning. Sit down and tell Reverend Bell what you told this room tonight, and it goes to the governor's office in your own words instead of mine." A long pause. The fire in the stove. The wind outside. Somewhere near the door, Bell's footsteps on the porch, quiet, unhurried waiting. Rusk sat down. Sat. It wasn't surrender the way surrender looked in the stories. He didn't break. He didn't weep. He just sat, and something went out of him the way things go out of people when the performance finally costs more than they have left to spend. Caleb opened the door. Reverend Samuel Bell was a lean man in his 60s, with a preacher's hands, long-fingered, ink-stained, folded now in front of him, with the patience of someone who had waited outside in February because he understood that some rooms need to finish their business before a witness enters. He looked at Caleb, then past him at the room. "Is everyone all right?" he said first, because that was the kind of man he was. "Yes," Caleb said. Bell came in. He looked at Abigail last, and when he did, he inclined his head, not a bow, not a performance, just the acknowledgement of one person who has been paying attention to another. "Miss Vale, I came as quickly as I could." "You came in time," she said. "That's what matters." Bell set his letters on the table beside the ledgers. Then he pulled the remaining chair to the table, sat down across from Rusk, and opened his notebook. "Sheriff," he said in the quiet, inexorable tone of a man who had heard confessions for 40 years and knew that most people, given the choice between silence and being truly heard, eventually chose to be heard. "Why don't you start at the beginning?" Rusk looked at the notebook, at Bell, at the room arranged around him, Reed and Lydia standing together, Abigail in her chair, Caleb by the wall, with his arms loose at his sides. He started at the beginning. It took 2 hours. Bell wrote without stopping, his pen moving, in the careful, consistent hand of a man making a record that is going to matter. Rusk spoke in the flat, drained voice of someone who has put down something heavy and discovered that putting it down is both relief and ruin. He named Harold Crane. He named the freight owners. He named Clara Jeffs and what had happened to her, and when he said that, Lydia Crane made a sound, just one, quickly controlled. That was the sound of someone who had suspected something terrible and had been right and would now have to live with having been right. When Rusk reached the land acquisitions, he stopped. "The eastern boundary," Abigail said. "Briar Hollow." Rusk looked at Caleb. "It was next," he said. Simply. Harold had already filed the survey request. Caleb nodded once. The same nod he'd used when Pete told him about the men on the ridge, the nod of a man absorbing a fact that confirms what he already knew and deciding what to do with it. "It's not next anymore," Caleb said. Rusk looked back at Bell's notebook. "No," he said. "I don't reckon it is." By midnight, it was done. Bell blotted the last page, closed his notebook, and looked at Abigail. "The documents," he said. "I'll need to take them to Helena myself. I won't trust them to the post." "Take them," she said. "I know every number by memory." Bell stood. He looked around the room at the deputy who had quit at Lydia, who was holding herself together by the particular discipline of a woman who has had a great deal of practice at Jonah Reed, who was leaning against the wall with his big arms crossed, and his face set in the permanent, unimpressed expression of a man who has heard enough to confirm every suspicion he'd had for 3 years. "I'll need all of you to sign the witness record," Bell said. "Every person in this room tonight." They signed, one by one, Caleb last. When Caleb set down the pen, Abigail was watching him. She didn't say anything. But her eyes said what they'd been building toward for 4 days. The thing that had no clean word in the language. The thing that lived between gratitude and trust, and the particular species of recognition that happens when two damaged people look at each other and see clearly for the first time in a long time. Reed and Bell took Rusk out together. The deputy who had quit went along without being asked, still carrying his badge in his hand, not knowing yet where to put it. Lydia Crane was the last to leave. She stood in the doorway with her husband's ledger under her arm and looked at Abigail. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the door I didn't open 3 months ago. I'm sorry I made you carry this longer than you should have had to." Abigail looked at her. "Are you going to be all right?" Lydia's chin lifted. "Harold and I have not been all right for a long time. At least now the reason is honest." She paused. "What happens to him?" "Is in Bell's hands and the governor's office," Abigail said. "Not mine. I'm not here for revenge, Mrs. Crane. I never was." Lydia looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and walked out into the cold, and the door closed behind her. The cabin was quiet. Caleb stood by the window and watched the lights of Bell's lantern move down the road until they were gone, and Briar Hollow settled back into silence, a different silence than it had held for 3 years, not empty, but still. The way a room feels after something important has been said and doesn't need to be said again. "You're bleeding again," he said without turning around. "A little," she admitted. He turned. She was pressing her arm her shoulder where the wrapping had shifted against the chair, her face tight. "Come here," he said. She stood, and he crossed to her and he replaced the linen at her side with the same quiet efficiency he'd used 4 days ago, and she sat with her jaw tight and her eyes on the middle distance, not pretending it didn't hurt, not making it larger than it was. When he was done, she let out a long breath. "It's over," he said. "The hard part is over," she said. "The rest is just waiting for institutions to do what institutions do slowly and imperfectly." She looked at her hands, at the space where hands weren't. Rusk has allies. Harold Crane has money. It will take time. "But it moves now," Caleb said. "It can't be stopped now." "No," she said. "It can't be stopped." He sat down in his chair across from her. The fire had burned low, and he didn't get up to add wood, and neither did she, and the cabin settled into warmth that wasn't about the stove anymore. "Where will you go?" he said. She looked at him. Really looked the way she had that first night when she'd been deciding whether to trust him. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've been moving toward this room for 3 months. I haven't thought past it." "You could stay," he said. The words came out simple and direct, the way things come out when a man has stopped managing what he says and started saying what he means. Abigail was quiet. "Not hidden," he said. "Not out of pity. Not because I feel responsible for you." He looked at the fire. "Because this ranch was a tomb before you got here, and it isn't anymore. And because you are the most capable person I have met in my adult life, and I would like to keep knowing you." He paused. "And because I think you could use a place that is yours as much as mine, and I think Briar Hollow could use what you'd bring to it." She didn't answer right away. Outside, the wind was quiet for the first time in days. The cold was still there. February in Montana didn't soften because a man had finally said an honest thing, but the wind had dropped, and the silence it left behind felt open rather than empty. "Ask me again," Abigail said finally. "When it doesn't feel like the end of something, ask me when it feels like the beginning." Caleb looked at her. "All right," he said. "I can do that." She settled back at the chair. Her eyes were tired and clear at the same time, the way eyes look when the thing a person has been braced against has finally passed and the bracing can ease. "Caleb," she said. "Still here," he said, the same way he'd said it in the dark 2 nights before. "I know," she said, and closed her eyes. He sat with her while the fire burned down and the road outside stayed empty, and Briar Hollow held them both in the particular piece of a place that has finally been used for something true. The letter from Helena arrived on a Thursday 3 weeks after Bell rode north with his notebook and 2 sealed envelopes, and the quiet certainty of a man carrying something that would not be ignored. Caleb brought it in from the road and set it on the table without opening it. He stood there with his coat still on and looked at it the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for long enough that the arrival feels almost unreal. Abigail came in from the back room. She'd been working at the table there, managing the ranch accounts with the methodical efficiency that had, over 3 weeks, quietly reorganized 4 years of Caleb's haphazard bookkeeping into something clean and accurate and functional. She saw the envelope and stopped. "Helena," she said. "Territorial Governor's seal." She crossed the room and stood beside him. "Open it." He opened it. He read it once to himself. Then he set it on the table, and she read it with her eyes moving fast and precise across the lines, the way they always moved when she was processing something important, not rushing, just absorbing at a speed that was entirely her own. Thomas Rusk had been removed from office and taken into territorial custody, pending a full criminal investigation. 2 of his deputies had turned state's evidence. Harold Crane had been arrested at his mill on charges of land fraud conspiracy and accessory to the suppression of criminal complaints. The proxy company had been dissolved. The land acquisitions, the Henderson parcel, the Purcell widow's land, the Garrett homestead had been flagged for legal review and potential restoration to rightful claimants. And at the bottom, in the clipped formal language of a government letter that was nonetheless trying to say something human, the territorial governor's office wished to acknowledge the courage and documentary precision of Miss Abigail Vale, whose evidence had made this investigation possible. Abigail read that line twice. She didn't cry. She wasn't a woman who cried easily, and Caleb had learned that about her the way he'd learned everything about her, not from being told, but from watching. She pressed her lips together once, and her chin lifted, and she exhaled slowly through her nose, and that was all. "It's real," she said. "It's real," he agreed. She turned and walked back toward the rear table and sat down and picked up the account ledger she'd been working on, and for a moment Caleb thought she was going to simply continue as if nothing had changed. Then he saw her hands, her feet, the way she held the pen, trembling slightly. Just slightly. The involuntary physical truth of a woman who had been holding something enormous for a very long time and had just been told she could put it down. He went and made coffee. He set a cup on the floor beside her without comment. She drank it without looking up. Neither of them needed to say anything. After 3 weeks, the cabin had learned their silences, the way houses learn the people inside them, distinguishing between the silence that was distance and the silence that was simply 2 people in the same place, thinking in the same direction. It was Lydia Crane who broke the outside world open again 4 days later. She came to Briar Hollow on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, in a wagon she was driving herself. Harold's horses, Harold's wagon, a fact that had its own particular statement in it. She knocked twice and waited, which was new. The Lydia Crane, who had run Carver Falls's women's social for 11 years, had always walked into rooms like she owned them because she more or less had. This Lydia waited. Abigail opened the door. The 2 women looked at each other on the threshold. Lydia's face was thinner than it had been at the cabin that night. The lines around her mouth were new, or newly visible, the lines of a woman who had spent 3 weeks dismantling the life she'd built around a man she was now watching be taken apart by a territorial court. "May I come in?" Lydia said. "Yes," Abigail said and stepped back. Lydia came in and sat at the table, and Caleb poured a third cup of coffee and then found somewhere else to be outside, checking the fence line he'd already checked twice that week, giving the room to the women who needed it. "Harold is cooperating with the investigation," Lydia said when the door had closed behind him. "His lawyer says cooperation may reduce the sentence. She stopped. "I don't know how I feel about that." "You don't have to know yet," Abigail said. "I keep thinking about Clara Jeffs." Lydia's hands tightened around the coffee cup. "The girl who disappeared. She was 19 years old, and she came to me once specifically and told me she was having trouble at the freight office. She didn't say what kind of trouble. I assumed it was a difficult employer. I told her to be patient and to work hard, and that respectable behavior would be its own protection." Her voice did not shake. It went flat, the way voices go flat when a person has already said the hardest version of a thing to themselves and is now just saying the words out loud. "That is the last conversation I had with Clara Jeffs." Abigail looked at her. "I know," she said. "I know you didn't understand what she was telling you." "I should have asked," Lydia said. "I should have asked what kind of trouble, and I didn't, because asking would have meant looking at something I didn't want to see." She set the cup down. "I have been not looking at things for a very long time, Miss Vale. And while I wasn't looking, a 19-year-old girl disappeared, and you were shot on a road in February, and my husband bought up widow's land for pennies, and I sat in my house and ran the church social and told myself that being a good woman meant keeping order. The silence after that was the kind that had weight. "Why are you here, Mrs. Crane?" Abigail said, not unkindly, directly. Lydia reached into her coat and produced an envelope. Not a government letter, something smaller and more personal. "There are 11 women in Carver County who lost property through Harold's acquisitions. The territorial court will try to restore the land, but that process takes time and money and legal navigation that most of these women don't have access to." She set the envelope on the table. "I have money of my own inheritance from my mother, kept separate from Harold's accounts, which is the single most useful thing my mother ever told me to do. I want to use it to help these women navigate the process." She paused. "But I don't know what I'm doing. I know how to run a church social. I know how to manage household accounts. I don't know how to read a land claim or a court filing." She looked at Abigail steadily. "You do." Abigail looked at the envelope, then at Lydia. "You're asking me to help you," she said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to work with me, as an equal." Lydia's voice was careful and specific. "I have the money and the social access. You have the knowledge and the credibility with the court after what Bell's report said about you." She paused. "Together we might actually accomplish something." Abigail was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Lydia's hands began to tighten around the coffee cup again. "I want it in writing," Abigail said. "Not because I don't trust you, because everything that has ever mattered to me has been in writing, and I have learned that verbal agreements are what people offer when they're not sure they'll keep them." Lydia blinked. Then slowly she almost smiled. "Fair," she said. "Absolutely fair. And I choose which women we help first, based on need, not on whose situation is most convenient." "Agreed." "And I am not your assistant in this," Abigail said. "We are partners, or I am not involved." "Partners," Lydia said, without hesitation, like a woman who has recently learned what it costs to choose comfort over clarity, and has decided she cannot afford to make that choice again. Abigail looked at the envelope one more time. Then she looked up. "Draw up the agreement and bring it back," she said. "I'll review it, and we'll sign it in front of a witness." Lydia let out a breath that had been in her chest for some time. She stood and picked up her coffee cup and finished what was in it with the straightforward efficiency of a woman who has been practicing new habits for 3 weeks and is getting better at them. "One more thing," she said at the door. The Sunday service this week, Reverend Bell is coming down from Carver Falls specifically. He's going to read a portion of the governor's letter into the public record of the church. She turned. He asked me to invite you, not to explain yourself, not to be put on display, just to be present, to let the town see you in the room. Abigail met her eyes. What does the town think of me right now? She said. Direct, wanting the honest answer. Lydia didn't look away. It's divided. Some people, more than you'd think, are relieved. They suspected things about Rusk and Crane for years, and were afraid to say so, and knowing someone else saw it and acted on it, it gives people permission to say what they already knew. She paused. And some people are uncomfortable. Not hostile exactly, but uncomfortable because you being right means they were wrong, and people don't love being wrong. She paused. But Bell in the pulpit reading from a territorial governor's letter is a different thing than gossip. It changes what the town has permission to believe out loud. Abigail was quiet. I'll think about it, she said. Lydia nodded and left. And when Caleb came back in from the fence line, Abigail was sitting at the table with the envelope in front of her, and a look on her face that he had come to recognize the look of a woman solving a problem that has more dimensions than it first appeared. Lydia wants to partner with me, she said, to help the women whose land was taken. What did you tell her? I told her to put it in writing. She looked up. What do you think? He sat down across from her and thought about it genuinely, the way she always expected him to think about things. She asked, not immediately, not with false confidence, but actually. I think Lydia Crane spent 11 years being the most capable person in Harold Crane's house, while Harold Crane took credit for the stability she built, he said. And I think she is angry about that now in a way that will last, and anger that lasts is useful if it's pointed at the right thing. He paused. And I think you need someone who can open doors in this county that won't open for you alone yet. Not because you aren't capable of opening them, because some doors are just about who knocks. Abigail looked at him. Belle asked me to come to the Sunday service, she said. Caleb said nothing. I haven't been in a church since I was 12 years old, she said. The last time I was in a church, a deacon told my mother that my condition was a sign of divine judgment, and that she should... She stopped. That she should consider whether God had intended for me to be born. The fire in the stove was the only sound in the room for a moment. What did your mother say? Caleb asked. She said that God had also intended for the deacon to be born, and she'd been wondering lately what the intended purpose of that was. A pause. Almost a laugh. She took my hand, my ankle, she held my ankle, and walked us out. Caleb looked at the table. Then he said, You don't have to go. Belle will read the letter either way. I know I don't have to. She looked at him. Do you think I should? I think, he said slowly, that there is a room full of people in that church who have a picture in their heads of who Abigail Vale is. And I think that picture was drawn by Thomas Rusk, and it looks nothing like you. And I think the only thing that replaces a wrong picture is a true one. He met her eyes. But I also think that walking into that room is going to cost you something. And I don't think you owe this county anything, and whatever you decide is right. She was quiet for a while. Will you come with me? She said. Yes, he said, without calculation, without pause. Obviously. Sunday came clear and cold, the kind of February morning that had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. Caleb drove the wagon, and Abigail sat beside him without the gray wrapping in a dark dress that Lydia had sent out to the ranch 2 days before, a practical frontier dress. Nothing elaborate, just well-made and properly fitted, and when Abigail had put it on and come into the main room, Caleb had looked at her in the specific way of a man seeing something true for the first time in clear light. He hadn't said anything. He had offered his arm to help her up into the wagon, and she had let him, and they had driven to Carver Falls in the kind of silence that isn't empty. The church was full. Caleb felt Abigail register it the moment the wagon stopped the full hitching post. The sound of voices inside the particular quality of a crowd that knows something important is about to happen and has shown up to witness it. He felt her go still beside him in the way she went still when she was deciding something. Ready, he said. "No," she said. "Let's go anyway." He helped her down, and they walked toward the church door together, and the people standing on the steps turned to look, and Caleb watched Abigail do the thing he had seen her do in his cabin in the dark when Rusk had walked in. She did not brace. She settled. She walked through those doors with her back straight and her chin level and her arms exactly as they were, which was to say, exactly as she was uncovered and unhidden and fully present. The room went quiet. Not the silence of hostility he would have known that would have put his hand at her back and turned them both around. This was the silence of a room full of people confronting the difference between what they'd been told and what they were seeing. Lydia Crane was in the third pew. She stood when she saw them and moved to make room, and that one gesture Lydia Crane, who everyone in Carver Falls knew, standing and making room, said something to the room that no letter from the governor's office could have said. They sat. Bell began. He read the governor's letter without preamble or editorial in his clear, steady preacher's voice, letting the words do what words do when they are true and spoken plainly in a place where people have gathered to listen. He read Abigail's name. He read what the letter said about her evidence and her courage and her precision. He read the list of charges against Rusk and Crane. He read it all, every line, without softening. When he finished, the room was still. Then Jonah Reed stood up. He was in the back. Caleb hadn't seen him come in, and he stood with his big arms loose at his sides, and his face carrying the same unimpressed permanent gravity it always carried. And he said in a voice that didn't need to be loud to reach every corner of the room, "I want the record to show that I witnessed what happened at Caleb Mercer's ranch 3 weeks ago, and every word of that letter is true, and any man or woman in this county who has a question about Miss Vale's character is welcome to come ask me directly." He sat back down. A pause. Then a woman in the middle of the room stood up. Caleb didn't know her name. She was small, middle-aged, with the worn look of a woman who had been working a homestead alone for some years. She didn't say anything. She just stood. Then another woman stood. Then two more. Then a man near the front, a farmer Caleb recognized from the feed store in Garnet. Then 3 more women. Then Pete Aldridge, who had come in late and was standing at the back near the door, and who now straightened to his full height with the satisfaction of a man who has ridden hard for something and arrived in time to see it matter. One by one, without coordination, without a signal, without anyone telling them to, they stood. Abigail did not cry, but her jaw moved once a small, involuntary clench, and her eyes went very bright, and she looked at the floor for just a moment, just long enough to hold whatever was moving through her, and then she looked back up at the room full of people standing for her, and her face was the face of a woman who has carried something alone for a very long time, and has just finally been allowed to put part of it down. Caleb was looking at her and not at the room, and he thought about May, who would have said something sharp and funny and completely accurate right now. He thought about his daughter, who had lived 2 days and been called wrong by people who had no right to the word. He thought about 3 years of a cabin that had been a tomb and a yard full of nothing but frost, and the particular silence of a man who has forgotten that life is supposed to move forward. He thought about a woman collapsed in the mud by his woodpile, who had asked him not to untie the cloth and had meant 100 things by it, most of which had nothing to do with cloth. After the service, people came to speak to Abigail. Not all of them, not even most, but enough that she was standing near the church door for 40 minutes afterwards speaking to a woman whose sister had filed a complaint against Rusk 2 years ago and been ignored, speaking to an older man who had watched the Henderson family lose their land and hadn't understood until now exactly how it had happened, speaking to a young woman who worked at the freight office in Garnet and had not filed a complaint because she had believed there was no point. Abigail talked to all of them, clearly, directly, with the particular attention of a person who knows what it costs to be dismissed and has decided never to do it to anyone else. Caleb stood near the wagon and let her work. Pete came and stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. "She's something," Pete said finally. "Yes," Caleb said. "May would have liked her." Caleb looked at the old man. "She would have," he said. "She really would have." Pete nodded once, adjusted his hat, went to tend the horses. The ride back to Briar Hollow was quiet. Not the careful quiet of two people managing something fragile. The settled quiet of two people who have been through something together and don't need to talk it into being real. The evidence was in the witnesses, had stood, the letter was in Helena, and the work that was coming. Lydia's partnership, the land claims the women who would need navigating through a system that had never been designed to help them. That work was real, and it was large, and it would take years. But the road back to Briar Hollow was quiet and good. When they reached the ranch, Abigail was the first one down from the wagon. She had gotten better at managing the step, not easier, not without effort, but practiced her own method of it fully hers, now in the way skills become yours, when you stop performing them for others and just do them. She walked across the yard and stopped at the small marker near the east fence. The simple wooden cross that Caleb had placed there 3 years ago and had not been able to stand in front of for long without turning away. She stood there. He came and stood beside her. The wind had dropped again. It did that in Montana in the late afternoon, dropped without warning, leaving a stillness so complete you could hear the specific silence of things that were no longer moving. "You've never told me her name," Abigail said. "Eleanor," he said. May picked it before she knew whether the baby was a boy or a girl. She said it worked either way. He looked at the cross. "Eleanor Mercer. She lived 2 days." Abigail was quiet. "She would have been 4 years old this spring," he said. Yes, he stood there with that for a moment, the particular weight of a birthday that has never happened, and keeps arriving anyway. Then he crouched and set his hand briefly on the frozen ground near the base of the cross. Not a performance, not for anyone watching, just the gesture of a man who has needed to do it for 3 years, and is finally able. He didn't say he was sorry. He said quietly, "I'm still here." He felt Abigail beside him, not touching just there, present the way she was present fully and without condition. He stood back up. "Caleb," she said. "Yes." "Ask me now." He turned and looked at her. Her face was turned toward the cross, and then she turned toward him, and the late afternoon light was the kind of light that had no forgiveness in it, honest, direct, showing everything clearly. Her eyes were clear, her chin was level. "Stay," he said. "Not hidden, not as a favor to either one of us. Stay because this is the right place, and we are the right people, and there is work here that is worth doing, and I would like to do it with you." He paused. "Stay, because you walked through a February night alone, and you didn't have to anymore, and I would very much like to be the man standing beside you when the next hard thing comes, and the one after that." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind stayed down. The ranch was quiet. The cross stood at the edge of the yard, small and plain and permanent. "Yes," she said. Not soft, not uncertain. The same yes she'd given him that first morning when he'd asked if he could carry her inside the yes of a woman who has weighed the question fully and means the answer completely. He reached out and she let him, and he took her shoulder in his hand, the way he had from the beginning, gently, without assumption, asking through the gesture itself. And she leaned into it by precisely the fraction she chose to lean, and that was everything. In the weeks that followed, Briar Hollow changed. Not all at once, nothing real changes all at once, but by increments that stacked up into something unmistakable. Abigail moved her work to the main table. The accounts for the ranch became accurate in ways they had not been for 4 years. A letter went out to Lydia Crane, signed by both of them, outlining the terms of their partnership in precise, clear language that left nothing open to interpretation. Lydia signed it and sent it back with a note that said, simply, "Good." The first woman arrived 6 weeks after the church service. Her name was Ruth Purcell, and she was 54 years old, and she had watched her late husband's parcel absorbed by Crane's proxy company, and had not known until the territorial investigation that it had been done illegally. She came to Briar Hollow because Lydia had sent word, and because she had nowhere else to go, and Abigail sat with her for 4 hours and walked her through every document and every option and every step of the process in language that was direct and honest and never once condescending. Ruth Purcell left with a clear plan and an advocate who knew what she was doing. She told 2 women, They told 3. By spring, the east room of Briar Hollow had become an office. Pete Aldridge, who had watched all of it from the comfortable position of a man who had known Caleb Mercer for 20 years and had a reasonable read on what mattered to him, mentioned one afternoon while mending fence that he had never in 20 years seen the boss move around the ranch the way he moved now. Less like a man managing a property, more like a man living in a place. Caleb told him to get back to work. Pete smiled and got back to work. The territorial court process moved the way institutions move slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and delays, and the occasional ruling that made Abigail set her pen down very deliberately and look at the ceiling for 30 seconds before picking it up again. Rusk's trial was set for the following fall. Harold Crane reached a partial agreement with prosecutors in April that Lydia found insufficient, and said so publicly in a letter to the county newspaper that she wrote at Abigail's table using phrasing that Abigail had reviewed and sharpened until every word carried exactly the weight it needed to carry. The letter ran on the front page. There was a Sunday in late March when Caleb came in from the yard to find Abigail at the main table with Ruth Purcell and 2 other women. All of them bent over a land claim document. Abigail's pen moving with the quick, authoritative precision that it always had when she was in the middle of something that mattered. She didn't look up when he came in. She was in the middle of a sentence. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room, the table full of women, the papers, the coffee cups, the morning light coming in through the window he'd finally repaired, and felt something settle in his chest that he had no specific word for. Not happiness exactly, though it contained that. Something older and more structural. The feeling of a house that has been given back its purpose. He went to make more coffee. Later, when the women had gone and the table was clear and the light had shifted toward evening, Abigail came and stood beside him at the window. "Ruth's claim is strong," she said. "If the court moves by summer, she'll have the land back before harvest." "Good," he said. She was quiet a moment. Then, "There are 4 more cases coming. Lydia has identified them. 2 are straightforward. 1 is complicated. The documentation was partially destroyed. The 4th..." She paused. "The 4th is Clara Jeffs' mother. She's 61 years old, and she's been living with a sister in Millhaven since Clara disappeared. She has nothing." Caleb looked at the window. At the yard beyond it, the cross at the east fence, small in the distance. "We'll help her," he said. "I know," Abigail said. "I'm telling you because I wanted you to know." He turned and looked at her. She was looking at the yard too, at the cross he thought, though maybe at the fence, or the horses, or something past all of it. Her face was the face of a woman who has arrived somewhere she did not know she was headed, and has found it to be against all reasonable expectation the right place. He had not said "I love you," neither had she. Those words would come, or they would find different words, or they would find no words at all, and simply keep building the thing they were building until it was undeniable and complete. There was time. For the first time in years there was time. "Abigail," he said. She looked at him. He had nothing specific to say. He just wanted to say her name in the room they shared in the ranch that had stopped being a tomb at the end of a day that had been full of useful things. He said it the way you say the name of something you want to make sure is still real. She understood. She always understood. "Still here," she said, and that was the truth of Briar Hollow. Not that a wounded man had saved a wounded woman. Not that the law had finally done what it was supposed to do. Not even that 2 people had found each other across a February yard and a frozen mud trail and a sheriff's lie. The truth was simpler and more durable than any of that. A woman who had been told her whole life that she was too broken to matter had taken every piece of evidence the world offered against that claim and turned it into the instrument of her own justice. And the man who had opened the door when every reasonable calculation said to keep it closed had discovered that grief is not a permanent address. It is a season, and seasons change, and what comes after winter is not nothing. It is everything that survived.